excuse me, sorry for that pause. We have the verdict now. We have a guilty verdict on 5
well, there you go.
of the 6 charges. On count 1, guilty, that's conspiracy to entice an individual under the age of 17 to travel in interstate commerce with intent to engage in illegal sexual activity. That was the 5 years in prison. Count 2, this is the not guilty, enticement of an individual under the age of 17 to travel with intent to engage in illegal sexual activity. Say maximum 5 years. So guilty of conspiracy, not guilty of the enticement itself, and then counts 3, 4, 5, and 6 are all guilty. Conspiracy to transport individuals under the age of 17, a minor, to travel in interstate commerce with intent to engage in illegal sexual activity. Transportation of an individual under the age of 17 with intent to engage in illegal sexual activity. Sex trafficking conspiracy, and sex trafficking of an individual under the age of 18, a minor. Count 6, that brings with it a maximum of 40 years in prison. Ghislaine Maxwell found guilty on 5 of her 6 federal charges tonight. 5 of the 6 means she could face a total of 65 years in prison. That's Ghislaine Maxwell on your screen right now, that tonight was found guilty by a federal jury on 5 of 6 counts, including transportation of an individual under the age of 17 with intent to engage in illegal sexual activity, in sex trafficking, and in sex trafficking conspiracy. Jason Chaffetz, your thoughts on this 5 of 6 guilty verdict return there?
You know, the best belief I have in the justice system is the jury, and the jury listened to it. They came to this conclusion, and hallelujah. There are a lot of women who went through hell, and I hope they feel some sense of justice. I don't think it'll ever make up for the hideous nature in which which was done. That what Jeffrey Epstein and Ms. Maxwell did is just one of the most disgusting things you can imagine for these young women. But I'm glad she's going to essentially spend the rest of her life in jail. And I hope that it is a good hope for those that have suffered these types of injustices, that have been assaulted, whether it's by themselves in an alley or whatever it might be, that justice can prevail. It's hard for these women. I can't even imagine what it's like to come forward and have to testify. I hope the 100 or so that didn't testify are able to speak or show the judge and talk to the judge in the sentencing phase if they want to come forward and talk about this. But there's also a lot more to this story. This guy didn't get prosecuted earlier, and it seemed like he probably should have. And there were a lot of other people that were complicit. And if the federal government's going to do their job, they need to go after those people as well.
All right, for more on this developing case, let's go to Alexis McAdams, our reporter outside the federal courthouse in New York City right now. Alexis.
Emily, that's right. Well, we've been waiting here for several days, standing by for any developments. Today, it was so quiet. The judge had told that jury she wanted them to stick around at least through 6 o'clock today due to major COVID concerns. She wanted to move things along as quick as possible without pushing them too much. And they did come to a decision just in the past 20 minutes or so, as you all just read. Guilty, Ghislaine Maxwell, on 5 out of 6 counts here. That coming out of that federal courthouse behind me just moments ago. As we go through those 6 counts, guilty on all of them except for count 2, which, as we know, is enticing a minor to travel to engage in illegal sex acts, which carries a maximum sentence of 5 years in prison. That was the charge that those jurors in that room even asked for a whiteboard, some markers and highlighters as they went and asked the judge to please clarify what enticement meant on those charges. And this comes after about 40 hours of deliberations today on day 6, that verdict finally coming out here. The judge telling the jurors that with that astronomical spike in COVID cases in New York, she wanted things to move along. She was worried that one of those jurors was going to have to go into quarantine, which would definitely disrupt the trial. The jury did have several questions just today. There was about a few notes that were sent out as well, but in the past, during those deliberations, including the holiday break that happened, they had asked 13 questions to the judge, sending out those notes, asking for more testimony, asking to see some more of that evidence. So it was a lot of us out here wondering if it was going to happen, especially because they ended yesterday around 5 o'clock when she asked them to stay an extra hour, saying, hey, I think we're in a good spot. We're going to head home for the night. And the jurors still had a lot of questions, even though today prosecutors telling them that she had groomed and trafficked underage girls to be sexually abused by her former boyfriend, Jeffrey Epstein. And after that long holiday weekend, they came back asking for the testimony from all four accusers and wanting the judge once again to clarify that definition of enticement. The jurors were deliberating for hours, but finally coming out. And we had so many people that were on the channel as well talking about, and legal experts saying, as the time continued to pass, Emily, they were saying, well, this could be good for the defense because it looks like, they were having a lot of questions still at this point. But that jury making the decision here after 40 hours of deliberations, in Manhattan, inside of that federal court, guilty Ghislaine Maxwell now in 5 out of 6 charges.
Alexis, thank you for that wrap up. And I wanted to circle back with you on one thing that you mentioned. So as the jury asked questions during their deliberative process, they kept asking questions. One of the transcripts that they asked for was that of the, quote, memory expert that defense brought. This is a famous psychological expert testimony witness that has testified in every trial from O.J. Simpson to Bill Cosby and Ted Bundy, Fred Durst. What was the tenor when the jury came back and asked for that transcript in the courtroom and amongst the pool of reporters? Did people expect a verdict that might not go the way that it went tonight, Alexis?
Yeah, I think it just depends, on who you ask and how long people were in there just watching things move along. But that was really interesting. That was the first time they'd asked for testimony and transcripts of the defense's witness. That came today. And as you mentioned, that expert said that when people go through trauma, that they can sometimes remember things, even though they're very vivid, as completely different than really what happened. So when they did ask for that today, I'm sure many people in the courtroom and people who've been watching this case from all over the country and all over the world, Emily, thought, how are things going to play out here? But guilty right now, Ghislaine Maxwell coming out of that federal court just moments ago. We also saw her family members showing up here. And I don't know if you can see too much over my shoulder here, but as we mentioned, it was silent out here. I mean, media, people are sitting in their cars just waiting and waiting. And then all of a sudden, when we obviously heard that there was a verdict, people were all over the place. And that's when we saw the Maxwell family as well.
Alexis, thank you so much for that. We are now going to bring in former Justice Department prosecutor Jim Trusty, who joins us there. Jim, thank you for joining us right now. Tell us your thoughts, top line, on Maxwell being guilty on 5 of her 6 federal charges tonight.
I think a couple of things, Emily. I mean, the first is that even though this took a while and the jury had a lot of questions, they struck me as being a cohesive group. They were asking questions. It sounded like they were very comfortable methodically plowing through the evidence and hearing each other out. There was really no sign of them being deadlocked or struggling from the outside. So I'm not totally shocked that we had a verdict today. The other thing is, what drives the sentencing in the federal system is not going to be the maximum penalty or even the exact constellation of charges. It's going to be the sentencing guidelines. And when I do just a very quick kind of cocktail napkin review of the guidelines, it's very quick to get them up to an offense level of 34, which translates to about 12 and a half to 15 and a half years of non-parolable time as a guideline, for these offenses. And it could get higher than that. So she's looking at a weighty sentence. There's going to be a lot of fighting about those guidelines, but it's going to be pretty inescapable that it should carry a lot of time.
Jim, I mean, humorous is not the right word, but when you talk about that she's facing 65 years, but practically speaking, it's only 12. I mean, that seems not a lot for the weight, the gravitas of these 6 federal charges that she was found guilty of that include enticing minors across state lines to engage in illegal sexual criminal acts. Do you think that that sentence would seem disappointing after, again, the weight of these 5 guilty counts?
Yeah, I mean, the guidelines are just the starting point. They're not the end point anymore like they used to be in the old days. So there's room for a judge to vary upwards, to go higher up. And one of the things that struck me about this trial, and one of the things I think was important to the jury, was that the enticement was not literally just enticement, persuasion, talking. The testimony of the women about her role in the offense included her sexually abusing them. So it was a very active, very aggressive, very criminal level of culpability that Ms. Maxwell had beyond just enticement. That's the type of thing that can aggravate the sentence, that allows the judge to go higher. But again, we fall into the trap of talking about maximum penalties like that's always the starting point, and it rarely is. So I think you're going to look at a weighty sentence, but probably not something to the tune of 50 or 60 years.
Jason Chaffetz has a question for you, Jim.
Sure.
Jim, what did you, obviously the prosecutors have to be pleased getting 5 of the 6 counts to get to guilty, but what did you think of the strategy by the prosecutors to only bring 4 of the victims? I know there are 24 witnesses, but the actual victims themselves, it seemed like a bit of a risky strategy, but maybe obviously, given the verdict, the prosecutors would say they made the right decision.
Yeah, I mean, it's always easy afterwards, right, to announce that we were definitely the smartest people in the room. But look, I think it's a great question. I think there's a little bit of a turning point, a point of diminishing returns. And, we have this issue with the Cosby trial, too, like how many victims are going to be allowed in. And the key is multiple victims are certainly self-bolstering. They make the case a lot easier for the government when it's not simply one person giving a story like this. So 4 certainly seem to work well here. The other thing I would just tell you from a defense perspective, when you get into dozens of witnesses testifying about similar incidents, there's room for inconsistencies. It may not be anything nefarious. It may just be that they have different memories, different abilities to perceive things. But even the blind squirrel starts finding a nut when you get up to 10 or 15 or 20 witnesses talking about the same thing. They will discover inconsistencies to argue reasonable doubt to the jury when you get that kind of high number of witnesses.
Jim, we have a statement of U.S. Attorney Damian Williams on this verdict, which reads, "A unanimous jury has found Ghislaine Maxwell guilty of one of the worst crimes imaginable, facilitating and participating in the sexual abuse of children, crimes that she committed with her longtime partner and co-conspirator, Jeffrey Epstein. The road to justice has been far too long, but today, justice has been done. I want to commend the bravery of the girls, now grown women, who stepped out of the shadows and into the courtroom. Their courage and willingness to face their abuser made this case and today's result possible. I also want to thank the career prosecutors of the Southern District of New York who embraced the victims' quest for justice and have worked tirelessly day in and day out to ensure that Maxwell was held accountable for her crimes. This office will always stand with victims, will always follow the facts wherever they lead, and will always fight to ensure that no one, no matter how powerful and well-connected, is above the law." That was a statement of U.S. Attorney Damian Williams on the verdict in the Ghislaine Maxwell case, Jim. And what's interesting about that is that it reflects squarely on the culpability and accountability of Ghislaine Maxwell herself. As you said, she participated herself physically in the abuse. It's part of the insidious nature of the enticement and what was encapsulated within that. And that begs the larger question that Jason brought up earlier, which was, do you see any type of additional work to prosecute, to go after those others who were complicit? Or do you see that the buck stops on her shoulders? Will the public be able to look forward to more being held accountable? Or do you see it ending now here today, Jim?
Yeah, that's a great crystal ball question, Emily, and I don't know is the short answer. But look, I will tell you this. A lot of career prosecutors that I know that have specialized in child abuse or sex offense cases are very keen on going after the Johns, as well as they call it, the men that participated in the sexual acts with these young women or sometimes children. And so, yeah, the natural tendency for a prosecutor is to keep going. And frankly, there's even the possibility of Maxwell still cooperating, partly because she didn't testify and complicate things by perjuring herself. So there is still room for the investigation to roll forward to try to tie in some maybe very high-profile individuals that hung out with Epstein at Orgy Island. And we'll have to take a wait and see. Maybe they've been trying that. Maybe they've already resigned themselves to this being the end game. There's certainly a high level of culpability for Miss Maxwell, but it is a shame if they walk away from the possibility of pursuing other people, too.
Johnny Joey Jones, do you have a question for Jim?
Yeah, Jim, you kind of just hit on exactly what I wanted to ask about. Not being a lawyer of any kind myself, I've kind of been relegated to interpreting documentaries and now what we've seen about this trial play out. But I guess, my biggest question is you do have a lot of high-profile individuals who have been either outright accused, like Prince Andrew, or kind of brought into the public eye on this. And I guess my question is, once sentencing happens, say it is a 50-year sentence, does she still have the opportunity to, I guess, turn evidence and testify against others to reduce her sentence, or does this guilty verdict kind of solidify whatever that sentence becomes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And look, there's still a mechanism under the federal rules to actually allow for a reduction of sentence based on cooperation. It's Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 35. And some offices use it more frequently than others. Some offices might say, hey, she went to trial, we're done with her. But other times, because she didn't testify, they might at least entertain having a proffer where they sit down and listen to her and see what she might be able to do in terms of moving an investigation forward. So legally, the mechanism is still there. It's really a question of the prosecutors in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Southern District of New York, whether they've already had any sort of proffers with her, which we don't know, that were failed, or if they are willing to listen, or again, if she's even willing to do it. So there's a bunch of ifs, but practically there's at least a possibility that at some point after her sentencing, she would be a government witness and would be looking at a potential for some sort of reduction in that sentence.
Jim, Leslie has a question for you. Leslie Marshall.
Hi, Jim. I had two questions. Actually, Jason asked my first about the victims, but secondly, to the victims. As a victim of sex crimes, I always look at situations like this being a positive and making it easier for people in the future to come forward, for those that feel that they're going to be victimized again or demonized by defense and that the system won't work and that it'll be a waste of time. Can you speak to that briefly?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, and look, I've handled as a prosecutor back in the day, I certainly handled sex offense cases, not of the profile of this type of case. And you always had this dynamic of reluctance, sometimes compounded by cultural divides, language divides, intelligence issues, all sorts of things that make these very tough cases. And I have to say that there's no such thing as perfect closure. These victims are still carrying scars that they'll carry for the rest of their days. But there is something about the reversal of power that's a good thing. When the people that are sitting in the defendant's chair have to sweat out the powerful testimony of these long victimized young women, it's a great moment. So I hope that it has that kind of universal effect. I don't know that there's any way to perfectly measure this, but it is a good message that, again, the criminal justice system, for all of its flaws, for all of its imperfections, it can get it right a lot. And in a case like this, to know that in the highest of profile cases that these victims were listened to, believed, and supported these convictions, that's a good moment.
Jim, we have a question for you from Tyrus.
Hey, how are you, Jim? One of the things that popped in my head, because I think the word conspiracy is really apropos, because she conspired to set up these things and was a willing participant, and I think that was a slam dunk for the prosecution. One of the things that does concern me in this new era of pandemics and COVID effect, I keep hearing the judge was concerned about COVID. He was concerned about a breakout, was concerned about a juror. Is there a leg for an appeal here saying the jury was rushed, that they would try to push something like that COVID caused the jury not to look at all the facts long enough for her? Can you see something like this start to happen in our courtrooms?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the appeal is going to be uphill when it comes to managing the jury and their deliberations. You're talking about an abuse of discretion standard, which means the trial judge has to really do something pretty bad to get reversed on appeal. But, the timing of this is interesting in that she basically let them know, hey, guys, I'd rather you stay longer because, COVID is on the horizon. We might have some problems with you, and you're going to have to sit through New Year's Eve, New Year's Day. All of a sudden, we get a verdict. So it's going to make its way into the defense brief, I would think. But that doesn't really give it enough legs to necessarily win. So, yeah, there's always an issue when it comes to things like jury selection and also the deliberations and decisions about whether or not the jury is sequestered. I think this could make its way into a brief, but I don't think it's going to be all that powerful to the circuit.
Jim Trusty, thank you as always for your amazing expertise. We appreciate it.
Sure. Good talking to you guys.